many are happy today? Yeah. Sun's out, it's June, things are good. It's just so good to be in the house of the Lord, and man, it's so good to have you here. Thank you for coming on a day like today, because I know a lot of people could be out on their boats or out at the beach. You're here, and I know God's going to bless you and honor you, and I'm just so grateful for that. We are going to continue in this series on excuses, the things that keep us from greatness in God. And today I want to talk about an interesting character in the Bible by the name of Gideon. Gideon has quite a story, and I'm not going to probably talk as much about the battle as what I would normally talk about, but I want to talk about the process in Gideon's life that brought him to the point where God used him to deliver the nation. And the process to me is the story, because the battle was the Lord's, and the process is the story. And I think that all of us can relate in some degree to where Gideon was at. So last week we talked about Moses, and I gave you 5 excuses that Moses gave the Lord as to why he couldn't, fulfill the plan of God in his life. I'm going to give you one excuse today that Gideon had, but it was a big one. It was just one. And I think that all of us can relate to it. So we're going to be in the book of Judges today, and we're going to be landing in Judges chapter 6. And we're going to just kind of go through the book here today, and my prayer is that you are encouraged. So let's talk about what was going on in Israel at the time in verse 1 of Judges 6. It says, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. And they arrived on droves of camels too numerous to count. And they stayed until the land was stripped bare. So Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. How many can identify with that? We wait until the very end, and then we say, God help us, instead of on the front end. But that's okay. The Midianites, let me just give you a little history here. The Midianites were nomads. And they were extremely brutal and powerful. They were vicious. They oppressed Israel without mercy. And they would invade Israel every harvest time to steal their crops. And as you know, for 7 years, most of the Israelites would go hide in caves during the harvest season. All the hard work that they put in would be gone. And so finally, Israel turned to God for help. And God heard them. In verse 11, we see that God sends an angel to start the process of getting Gideon ready for what he was going to do. In verse 11, it says, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. So here we are introduced to this character named Gideon. And what we immediately read here is that he was doing something that was not intended for. He was threshing wheat in a winepress. So, it's easy to read past that, but you need to understand that a wine press did what? It pressed grapes, right? To get the juice out. It was usually made of stone. They would press the grapes. That's what a wine press was for. And in this case, it sounds like it was inside somewhere, maybe a basement or a cave even, I don't know. But threshing wheat had nothing to do with pressing grapes. And so what they would normally do when they would, there was a term called winnowing, and what they would do with the grain is they would crush the grain, and then they would throw the grain, and they would be on a hill, on a hill where there would be wind. They would throw the grain up into the air, and the wind would blow away the chaff, which would be like the thin shell, and the grain itself would fall to the ground. That's how they would separate the grain from the chaff. And so, he should have been doing that, obviously, but now we know the backstory that if he was doing that and he was seen by the Midianites, they would probably come and steal all of his grain. So he is reduced to being in this place, trying to do it on a wine press. In his own mind, I'm sure Gideon was thinking that God had abandoned him and his people. And so this angel shows up, and in verse 13, Gideon says, "Sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors have told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." You ever ask the Lord, well, if you're with us, if you're with me, why has all this stuff happened in my life to me? Sure. But in this exchange with the angel of the Lord, Gideon is reminded of a fundamental truth of his Jewish faith, and that is this, that the Lord is present with his people. This is the core of the Jewish faith. And they were supposed to hold on to that truth forever. And regardless of what would happen to them, they would always have to remember that the Lord was with them. But Gideon, like so many of us, was allowing his current situation to alter his view of God. To instead of holding firmly to the fact that God is with us, he abandoned what he knew and submitted to his current situation. Let me just say this. One person plus God always equals a majority. Verse 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." I love the fact that Gideon just was commissioned to be a major general in an army that doesn't yet exist. And he's in the basement on a wine press because he's afraid of the Midianites, and God says, "Hello, mighty warrior." I'm sure he didn't feel like a mighty warrior at the time. But here's Gideon's excuse, the one excuse. He said, "But Lord, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." What Gideon is really saying is this: I struggle with fear, I struggle with weakness, I struggle with insecurity, I struggle with intimidation. I don't have a high view of myself or my calling or who I am. You know, when our faith is low, the enemy will loom over us like darkness does to a child. But when our faith is high, we see the enemy as God sees him, which is reduced. So God answers Gideon, and God says in verse 16, "I will be with you." Remember, we talked about that last week with Moses. I will be with you. What you need to walk away with today from this place, the last 2 weeks we've talked about this, is no matter what you're going through, God is with you. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't turned his back on you. He's not against you. He is for you, and he's with you. And God says, "And you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." Gideon replied, "If you are truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you." He answered, "I will stay here until you return." Gideon's not a man of great faith. He's not a noble warrior. He's not a valiant, courageous soldier. He's not a hero. This is a man of weakness. And yet, the angel calls him a mighty warrior, a man of valor. You know what that tells me? God saw him not because of what he was at that moment, but because of what he was going to be. And when God looks at you, he doesn't necessarily call you by name of who you are or what you're doing at the moment, but what you could be. Gideon really was in need of a personal encounter with God, wasn't he? And God met him right where he was, giving him a sense of peace and purpose for his life by his presence. And so now we start to literally see that Gideon goes from being despondent to being dependent. And there's a big difference. Gideon then prepares food for the angel. He prepares a meal. And he brings it back, and the angel tells him to put the food on the rock and then pour the broth over the food. And then the angel reaches out his staff, and with the tip of his staff touches the meal, touches the meat. And fire comes from within the rock and completely consumes the meal. In verse 23 it says, Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and named it Yahweh Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. Gideon builds an altar calling it the Lord is peace. But the Lord had just told him to go and start a war. So how do you have peace and you're about to go into a war? How do the two coexist? Well, this gives us a clue into Jewish thought. Peace is not what we think it is, according to the Jewish mind, Jewish belief. When we think of peace, we always think that peace is the absence of conflict or the elimination of stress, right? If I can just go on vacation and not be stressed out, then I'll have peace. Well, that's the way we look at peace. And for us, when we describe peace, it's always the absence of something. It's a negative connotation. I have peace if there's no conflict. I have peace if there's no stress. I have peace if I'm in a safe place. It always comes from a negative perspective. And that's why we have such a hard time finding real peace. Because I believe that in our culture, in our day, we look at peace in the wrong way. It's not stopping conflict or getting rid of stress. The Hebrews' understanding of peace, in the Jewish mind, it has nothing to do with any of that. What it means is, I want you to get this, that things are in order. To the Jewish mind, that's what peace would mean, that things are in order. St. Augustine said, he called it the tranquility of order. Tranquility means peacefulness. So you could say the peacefulness of order. And that idea spills off into the New Testament when Jesus told the disciples, in this world, you're going to have trouble. In me, you will have peace. What? I'd like it much better if the Lord said, in this world, you'll have peace. Just follow me. No, he said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have conflict. You're going to have things. But in me, you will have peace. So again, we have this idea of two things coexisting. Peace is the deep-rooted tranquility of order in the midst of your trouble. And that's the key. So Gideon here is beginning to turn a corner. He is no longer despondent Gideon. He is now dependent Gideon. But his faith is still on a journey, just like all of ours is. We haven't yet arrived, right? We're not like superpower faith people yet. But God is making us that way. Verse 25, it says, that night the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old, pull down your father's altar to Baal, cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it, and then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood from the Asherah pole you cut down. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded. But he did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. So he wasn't this valiant warrior yet. He was still Gideon, a farmer. But before this is, I want you to get this into your spirit today. Before Gideon could be used publicly, he first had to clean up his house. His family had idols on their property of Baal and Asherah, and this was his first assignment. He was to take his dad's prized 7-year-old bull, pull down the Asherah poles and the Baal poles, which were made of wood, burn the poles, but sacrifice the bull on top of the burnt wood. What's the point in telling us all this? Why is this included in Scripture? Because if you want to learn to trust God, before you can be used mightily, He must be magnified in your personal life. And you have to get your home in order. Private worship prepares you for public power. There are no shortcuts to that. Verse 34 says, Then the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon with power, and he blew a ram's horn as a call to arms. D.L. Moody said this. He said, Give me 10 men who fear nothing but sin and love nothing but God, and I shall change the world. Isn't that amazing? I'm going to ask our worship team to start to make their way out. And I want to just close with what eventually happened, because this is a cool part of the story. There were 135,000 Midianites. Gideon had assembled 32,000 fighting men. So there's 102,000 swing. So he was outnumbered. And I'm sure Gideon's thinking, I've got 32,000 men. We're up against 135,000 Midianites. It's going to be tough. But maybe he was feeling a little confident. But God said to Gideon, those 32,000 men, that's too many. And so the army was reduced, and you have to go back and read it, reduced to 10,000 men. And God said to Gideon, still too many. And that army was reduced to the point where there were 300 fighting men left against 135,000. And God said, that's enough. I can use that. And one of the strangest battles in history, 300 of those men went out with trumpets, torches, and jars and went into the enemy's camp. And they brought so much confusion that the Midianites began attacking each other. And when it was all over, 120,000 Midianites lay dead, and 15,000 fled for their lives, and the battle was over. God used a common farmer to answer Israel's prayers. So I have a few thoughts that I want to close with, a few nuggets that I pulled from this story that I just felt like encouraged my own life, and I hope it encourages you. These are some nuggets that I've pulled out. God uses tough times to get our attention. God uses tough times to get our attention. God sees more than we do. He sees things from a higher perspective than you and I see things, right? We see it from one angle, one perspective. God sees it from multi-angles. God confirms His plan with His presence. His plan for your life is always revealed to you through His presence. Private faithfulness is a prerequisite for public usefulness. Private faithfulness is a prerequisite for public usefulness. Just a couple more. God is patient with our faith process. You know, Gideon wasn't the general, the soldier, the mighty warrior at the beginning or even halfway through that he was in the end. In fact, he never really was a valiant warrior, was he? He was a guy that trusted God. I don't think Gideon ever had to pull his sword out. He just led this faith army that came in with trumpets and torches and jars. You imagine the questions that would have. And when you go in the enemy's camp, and when you, all at the same time, when you hear the sound, just light your torches. I'm gonna die, man. Success is determined by God's power and not our own. My friend, I don't know where you're at or where you're walking through today, but I think that what I want to encourage you with today is that if God can use a farmer named Gideon to rescue a nation, God can use you for anything. God can work in your life. And the thing I love about this story is how God viewed Gideon. God looked at Gideon of what he could be, not what he was. And so when God looks at you, he sees someone that's mighty. He sees a mighty woman of God. He sees a mighty man of God. When God looks at your kids, he doesn't focus on where they're at right now at this very moment, but he focuses on what they could be and what they're going to be. You plus God equals a majority.